Now, the threats against Donald Trump, they are very real. The lack of urgency, the lack of accountability at the DHS, and frankly, the entire Biden-Harris administration is beyond appalling. Make no mistake, Donald Trump has a huge base of devoted supporters. Now, there are Americans who would walk over hot coals to vote for him, and they will. But there are also people who hate the former president with a passion which has now made him, obviously, the #1 target in terms of assassination in our country. He has a lot of enemies. The Democratic Party, state-run media mob, the deep state, government officials. Trump derangement syndrome is very real. They have demonized him. They have besmirched him. They have smeared him. They have slandered him. They have created a caricature of him. In less than a decade, Donald Trump has gone from a billionaire celebrity, beloved by Democrats and the media, to a Republican these same people now referred to constantly as a threat to democracy because Donald Trump's politics and rhetoric did not align with this Democratic machine, and many on the left have done nothing but vilify him and even at times glorified violence against him. Take a look.
That man cannot see public office again. He is not only unfit, he is destructive to our democracy, and he has to be eliminated.
The donor class can't just sit back on the sidelines and say, "Oh, well, don't worry, this will all work itself out." They're still going to have to go out and put a bullet in Donald Trump, and that's a fact.
Yes, I have thought an awful lot about blowing up the White House.
When was the last time an actor assassinated a president? I want to clarify, I'm not an actor. I lie for a living. However, it's been a while. And maybe it's time.
How dare he say the things he does? Of course I want to punch him in the face.
Right. Yes.
Press always asks me, don't I wish I were debating him? No, I wish we were in high school. I could take him behind the gym. That's what I wish.
And with this kind of inspiration, I will go and take Trump out tonight.
Can you imagine any conservative said anything similar about any Democrat? Now, even Trump's 2020 opponent once joked about killing the former president, you might recall, and it's not funny.
If you had to be stuck in an elevator with either President Trump, Mike Pence, or Jeff Sessions, who would it be?
Does one of us have to come out alive?
Now, for years, Donald Trump, his family, his supporters have been vilified, dehumanized. Falsely, they create the ridiculous caricature of him that remains in the minds of too many people. But despite nonstop hysteria, let's see, the Russia hoax, the Mueller witch hunt, the 2 bogus impeachment, Hillary Clinton's dirty Russian disinformation dossier, a weaponized DOJ, they cannot erase a simple fact. And that is that Donald Trump's presidency was marked by sound policies and stability, and you are not better off 4 years with having had Kamala Harris and Joe Biden in office. Back when Trump was president, the economy was strong. It was rebounding well from COVID. The world was a far more peaceful place. Gas was cheap. Productivity was high. He set record after record low unemployment for every demographic in the country. Our borders, they were secure. Trump did not cause a world war or become a dictator. He upheld the U.S. Constitution. He worked within 3 branches of government to implement his agenda. Democrats, the mob, the media, well, they lie repeatedly and say Donald Trump is a threat to democracy. What do people think when they hear this? You decide.
Watch what happens. It's a danger. He's a genuine danger to American security.
You know, Donald Trump presents a challenge and a threat fundamentally to the republic.
Donald Trump is an existential threat to our democracy and our most fundamental freedoms.
Don't give them the power. Look, are they a threat to democracy? Yes. Are they going to take our rights away? Yes.
Let's not pretend that Donald Trump isn't exactly like Mussolini, exactly like Hitler. He is that guy.
Donald Trump presents
an existential threat to democracy. He has advertised he is going to transition this country from a democracy to a dictatorship.
He is paving the way to become a Vladimir Putin or to become an Adolf Hitler or a Kim Jong-un. That's what he wants to be.
We have to defeat a person who is a threat to our democracy of the kind that we have not seen.
Adolf Hitler, Vladimir Putin. Now, two psychotic Democrats took that rhetoric to heart and now tried to murder Donald Trump. And yet the White House continues to fan the flames. According to Karine Jean-Pierre, the real danger is coming from anyone who attempts to question their radical and extreme rhetoric. Take a look at this.
How many more assassination attempts on Donald Trump until the president and the vice president and you pick a different word to describe Trump other than threat?
Peter, if anything from this administration, I actually completely disagree with the premise of your question, the question that you're asking. It is also incredibly dangerous in the way that you're asking it because American people are watching.
A lot of people listening, too. Just to recap, Democrats told everyone Trump was evil, the next coming of Hitler, plotting to end American democracy. People make direct threats about blowing up the White House, assassinating Donald Trump. Nothing happens to them. Two people then try to assassinate Donald Trump while he's running for re-election. The White House thinks it's dangerous for anyone to ask about the extreme rhetoric coming from their side. Of course, Democrats are not going to make any effort to bring down the temperature. Just one day after Trump was almost killed, Hillary Clinton, she goes on MSDNC and told the network's top conspiracy theorists and their viewers that Trump is a danger to the country and the entire world. The day after he got shot, or a guy attempted to kill him, he had a wannabe assassin in the bushes, and thankfully he was stopped. One day after. Take a look.
Journalists should, really try to achieve objectivity. And by that, he said, I mean, they should cover the object. Well, the object in this case is Donald Trump, his demagoguery, his danger to our country and the world, and stick with it.
I'd actually like Hillary to explain how she, had funds that she funneled through a law firm, to an op research firm, and a former MI6 agent, and got Russian disinformation that was used for 4 FISA warrants. I don't know. Curious people would like to know. I'd like to know how Hillary Clinton deleted 33,000 subpoenaed emails, wasn't held accountable for that, or had top secret classified information on her servers. I'd like to know all that, too. Hillary Clinton so deeply worried about the spread of misinformation? Well, she now wants Americans to be thrown in jail for posting so-called misinformation online. Take a look.
I think it's important to indict the Russians, just as Mueller indicted a lot of Russians who were engaged in direct election interference and boosting Trump back in 2016. But I also think there are Americans who are engaged in this kind of propaganda, and whether they should be civilly or even in some cases criminally charged is something that would be a better deterrent.
And, of course, with the DOJ, the weaponized DOJ of Harris and Biden, they think if you talk about inflation, you could be spreading Russian disinformation, even though it's completely true. Never forget Hillary Clinton, her campaign funneled that money through that law firm to hire an ex-foreign spy that put together the dirty Russian disinformation dossier, which has been completely debunked, although it was then used by James Comey and others to get 4 FISA warrants to backdoor spy on Donald Trump, the candidate, the president, and she and all of her co-conspirators and all of those who peddled their lies were never held accountable. This is the very definition of election interference. Hillary, her campaign, were even forced to pay a huge fine for lying about the dossier, calling it a legal expense. If she lived in New York and they actually had equal justice under the law, she would have been tried for that. Hillary Clinton, frankly, the queen herself of misinformation. And so, of course, she appears on the show's on this country's, #1 conspiracy theorist show on MSDNC and spreads more propaganda and lies. Now, of course, most Democrats, they don't really care about misinformation or democracy or divisive rhetoric. They use it all the time. Now, these are merely tools that they use to gain and hold on to power. It's a means to an end. And, of course, when something bad happens, like an assassination attempt against Trump, then they just blame Donald Trump. I can't make this up. Take a look.
Just the fact that right now you have a former president who, yes, has been the target of apparent assassinations twice, but is also an instigator of political violence.
So, you don't get to be a very big part of the problem and then pretend that it's just the other people on the other side who caused this.
I mean, the irony of it is that the violence, the actual violence we're seeing, comes much more disproportionately from MAGA themselves.
Do you expect to hear anything from the Trump campaign about toning down the rhetoric, toning down the violence, or would that be atypical of the former president?
You hear this fight, fight, fight chant, which you heard Trump do right after the shooting in Butler. We saw that once again on Truth Social. That does scare me a little bit.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.